They were given metal cups of water that looked ordinary at first glance. But when they lifted them, the chill was immediate, and a few prisoners paused because the water felt far colder than what they were used to drinking. And when they noticed small pieces of ice floating inside, some quietly hesitated, since in their experience, very cold water was often avoided, especially in the morning. And as they watched Americans drink it without concern, a simple question formed among them, wondering why anyone would choose water that cold during a normal meal. When the first groups of German prisoners settled into American camps, they paid close attention to food and drink because meals were one of the few predictable points in each day, and predictability mattered in confinement since it helped men measure time and maintain a sense of routine. Yet predictability did not always mean familiarity, because what appeared on the tables sometimes reflected habits shaped by a different climate and culture. And among those habits, the temperature of drinking. Water stood out in a quiet but noticeable way, since many of the prisoners came from places where water was typically consumed cool or at room temperature rather than chilled, especially in the morning. And this expectation came from long-standing beliefs that very cold water could upset the stomach or strain the body. Ideas passed down through families and reinforced by limited access to refrigeration in many European homes during the 1930s and early 1940s. In the camps, however, water often arrived already cool, and on warmer days it could be distinctly cold, sometimes drawn from large containers kept in shaded or insulated areas. And in certain seasons, small pieces of ice appeared in the cups, which immediately signaled a difference in practice, because ice in drinks was not an everyday feature in many of the prisoners' previous lives, and its presence suggested access to refrigeration or ice production that felt unusual during wartime. And this detail alone invited quiet observation, since prisoners learned to study their environment carefully rather than react quickly. The first reactions were restrained, because men in captivity rarely drew attention to minor surprises, yet hesitation could be seen in the way some held their cups longer before drinking, testing the temperature with small sips. And this caution reflected habit more than fear, since people tend to follow what their bodies are used to, and sudden changes in routine, even in something as simple as water temperature, can feel significant when daily life is otherwise tightly controlled. They also noticed that American staff drank the same water without concern, which indicated that the practice was normal locally, and normal practices usually arise from environment, since climate influences how people prefer their drinks. And in many parts of the United States, warmer weather made cold water refreshing rather than suspicious. And widespread refrigeration by the 1940s allowed ice to be produced and stored more easily than in many wartime European settings, where electricity, equipment, and household appliances were less consistently available. For the prisoners, this difference did not carry drama, yet it created a small moment of cultural contrast, because drinking habits are learned early and rarely questioned until one encounters a different system. And seeing others treat ice water as ordinary prompted some men to reconsider their assumptions, though quietly, since captivity encourages observation more than debate. They did not refuse the water and did not request alternatives, because adaptability was part of daily survival. And over time, small exposures often reduce hesitation, yet those first impressions remain noticeable, because sensory experiences like temperature leave quick and clear memories, especially when they differ from expectation. The guards offered no explanation, and none was needed from their perspective, since the water was simply prepared according to local standards, and this lack of commentary reinforced that the difference lay in habit rather than policy, and understanding that helped prisoners frame the experience as cultural rather than personal. In this way, A simple cup of cold water became one of the early details through which the men recognized that daily life around them followed patterns shaped by American climate, technology, and custom. And although it did not change their circumstances, it added another small piece to their growing awareness that captivity in this country would expose them to ordinary differences as much as to rules and routines. With even the temperature of water quietly reflecting a world that operated differently from the one they had left behind. As the days passed and cold water continued to appear at meals, the prisoners began to treat it less as a surprise and more as something to observe carefully, because repeated exposure invites evaluation, and evaluation helps people decide whether a new habit is safe to adopt, and many of these men relied on observation rather than immediate trust, since wartime experience had taught them that the body reacts best to what it knows, and sudden changes in diet or routine were often approached with caution. They noticed that the cold water was served consistently, not only once or twice, and consistency suggested intention rather than accident. And intention implied that the camp expected prisoners to drink it without issue, and this expectation was quietly tested by watching others first, since people often look to nearby behavior to guide their own, especially in unfamiliar settings. And seeing American staff drink the same water without hesitation provided a practical reference point, because shared consumption signals normalcy more clearly than explanation. Some prisoners experimented by taking smaller sips, letting the water warm slightly before swallowing. And this gradual approach reflected how the human body adjusts to temperature differences, since adaptation often happens step by step rather than instantly, and small steps feel safer when routines are already limited. Among the prisoners were men who had worked in trades or urban settings before the war and had occasional exposure to chilled drinks. And these individuals sometimes reassured others quietly that cold water itself was not harmful. And such peer-to-peer reassurance carried weight because it came from familiar voices rather than authority, and familiar voices often influence acceptance more effectively in confined communities. They also began to think practically about why the water was cold, and practical thinking reduced unease because logical explanations replace uncertainty, and the most obvious explanation pointed to refrigeration and ice production, which were more widespread in the United States by the 1940s. And large institutions like camps often used ice boxes, insulated containers, or delivered ice to keep supplies cool, especially in warmer regions, and keeping water cold could also make it more refreshing and reduce the risk of spoilage when stored in large quantities. The climate itself played a role, because in hotter weather cold water helps regulate comfort, and comfort supports orderly behavior in large groups, and administrators managing hundreds of men would naturally consider such factors, not as favors, but as practical measures to maintain routine and health. And this framed the cold water as part of operational planning rather than cultural display. At the tables, reactions gradually softened, and hesitation turned into neutral acceptance for many, though not for all, because habits formed over a lifetime do not disappear quickly, and individual preference always varies, and some men continued to drink slowly while others adjusted faster. Yet no one treated the water as remarkable after repeated exposure, since repetition reduces novelty. The guards never emphasized the practice and never explained it, and this neutrality reinforced that the water temperature was simply standard procedure. And when something is standard, it rarely draws attention from those providing it, which further signaled that the difference came from local habit rather than special policy. By this stage, the cold water had shifted from question to known detail, and this shift illustrates how adaptation works through observation, testing, and routine, turning unfamiliar experiences into accepted facts. and showing that even small differences at a table can reveal how environment and technology shape daily life during wartime, one cup at a time. As the presence of cold water continued without interruption, many prisoners reached a point where the question was no longer whether it was safe, but simply whether it suited their preference, because once the body experiences something repeatedly without harm, the mind relaxes its caution, and this gradual easing of concern reflects how human habits adjust when evidence replaces assumption. And evidence, in this case, came from daily routine rather than instruction. They noticed that the temperature of the water often depended on the time of day and storage method, since water drawn earlier from insulated containers stayed colder, while later servings warmed slightly. And this variation showed that the chill came from storage conditions rather than deliberate treatment at the moment of serving, and recognizing this grounded the practice in logistics rather than symbolism, because logistics explain many institutional habits more clearly than culture alone. Some prisoners began to drink the water more freely, especially on warmer days, because physical comfort can influence acceptance faster than reasoning does, and a cool drink after work or during heat naturally felt refreshing, even to those who had once doubted it. And this illustrates how the body can lead adaptation when the mind remains cautious. Others still preferred to sip slowly, allowing the water to warm in the cup. And this personal adjustment shows that adaptation does not require uniform behavior, since individuals often find their own balance within a shared system. And such balance helps maintain a sense of control, even in small ways. Conversations about the water remained practical and brief, focusing on temperature rather than belief, because prisoners learned to keep discussions neutral, and neutral topics supported calm interactions in crowded settings. And food and drink often served as safe subjects since they were part of daily routine rather than politics. They also recognized that American civilian life likely included similar habits, because institutions rarely invent practices that do not exist outside their walls, and this realization quietly expanded their understanding of local culture, showing that cold drinks were not a camp-specific choice, but part of broader domestic life shaped by climate and technology. Refrigeration technology by the 1940s had become common in many parts of the United States, and ice delivery systems had existed in cities for decades. And these systems made chilled drinks practical rather than exceptional. And understanding this connected the cup in their hands to a larger infrastructure beyond the camp. And such connections helped prisoners interpret their surroundings through logic rather than guesswork. The guards' continued neutrality reinforced that no special meaning was attached to the water. And when providers treat something as ordinary, it usually is, and this consistent neutrality removed the last sense of mystery, leaving only personal preference in its place. By this stage, the cold water no longer represented a cultural puzzle, but a routine feature of meals. And this transition from unfamiliar to normal demonstrates how exposure and context gradually reshape expectations, especially in environments where daily life repeats the same patterns. In this way, the prisoner's relationship with cold water reflected a broader process of adaptation, where small sensory differences introduced new understanding about the society around them, showing that even the simplest details can quietly reveal how climate, technology, and habit influence everyday life during wartime. As the weeks turned into months, the cold water gradually stopped standing out at all, because the mind cannot treat the same detail as unusual forever. And once something appears reliably, it moves into the background of daily expectation, and for many prisoners the chilled cups became just another fixed element of the meal routine, no more remarkable than the trays, benches, or the order in which food was served. And this shift shows how repetition quietly reshapes perception without requiring any deliberate decision. They no longer tested the temperature with cautious sips or exchanged brief looks across the table. since the water had proven consistent and harmless. And consistency reduces the need for attention, because what behaves the same way each day rarely invites analysis. And in a confined environment where many aspects of life were controlled, predictable details could actually make the day feel more stable. Some men even began to associate the cool water with relief after warm weather or work periods, because physical comfort can influence acceptance more strongly than prior belief. And when the body finds something refreshing, the mind often adjusts its judgment. And this illustrates how adaptation sometimes follows sensation rather than reasoning. The kitchen staff continued serving water in the same manner without explanation or emphasis, and this neutrality reinforced that the practice was simply standard procedure. And when something is standard, it rarely receives commentary from those providing it, which further signaled that the difference lay in local habit rather than any special policy directed at prisoners. They also understood by now that maintaining cool water could be practical for large groups, since cooler temperatures slow the growth of impurities and keep stored water more palatable. And institutions managing many people often prioritize such practical considerations, because health and order depend on reliable basics, and reliable basics support routine. For the prisoners, the cold water never changed the boundaries of their confinement and never carried symbolic meaning. Yet it contributed to the steady rhythm that defined each day, and rhythm matters in long captivity because it divides time into predictable segments. And predictable segments reduce mental strain compared to constant uncertainty. The earlier surprise faded into memory, though some men still recalled their first hesitation, because first impressions tend to remain even after habits change, and those memories later help them describe how small differences marked their early days in American camps. By this point, the water temperature was simply part of how things were done, and when something becomes part of how things are done, it stops feeling foreign and starts feeling expected, even if it once seemed strange. In this steady progression from caution to normality, the cold water illustrated how people adapt through repeated exposure, turning unfamiliar customs into routine facts, and showing that daily life in another country can feel different not only in large ways, but also in the smallest sensory details. And in that quiet adjustment, the men learned something simple but lasting, that habits tied to climate and technology often shape everyday life more than rules do, and that understanding these habits can make an unfamiliar environment easier to navigate, one ordinary cup at a time. As time continued and the cold water fully blended into routine, some prisoners began to see it less as a personal preference and more as a reflection of the system around them, because daily practices inside institutions often mirror the habits of the wider society. And when something appears consistently in a controlled setting, it usually exists outside it as well. And this understanding helped them connect the simple cup of water to a broader picture of American daily life shaped by climate, infrastructure, and domestic technology. They recognized that widespread refrigeration, ice production, and reliable electricity made chilled drinks practical in many parts of the United States by the 1940s, and these systems allowed food and beverages to be stored safely for longer periods. And this practical advantage influenced how people consumed water at home and in institutions. And seeing the results firsthand provided clearer evidence than any explanation could, since experience often teaches more directly than words. Among the prisoners were men who had worked in mechanical trades or transport roles, and these individuals understood how supply systems depend on stable power, equipment, and delivery networks, and they could imagine how ice or cooled water reached large facilities through organized logistics. And thinking in these terms framed the cold water as the final step in a long chain of infrastructure rather than a simple choice at the table. For the prisoners themselves, the chilled water did not improve their status and did not change the limits placed on them. yet it added a small layer of predictability to daily life. And predictability matters in confinement because it reduces minor worries about basic needs. And when a man trusts that food and drink will arrive consistently, his attention can settle on routine instead of uncertainty. Some later reflected that what stayed in memory was not the temperature itself, but what it suggested about stability. Because after years where supply could change suddenly, seeing the same practice continue calmly each day created a contrast that was quietly meaningful, even if it was rarely discussed. Still, the men remained practical in their interpretation, understanding that camp administration focused on order and health rather than comfort, and viewing the water through that lens helped them avoid attaching symbolic meaning where none was intended, which supported steady thinking in a restricted environment. Over time, the cold water became just another expected part of meals, yet it quietly illustrated how wartime life differed by location. Since global conflict does not produce identical conditions everywhere, and local resources often shape daily experience more than distant events do. By this stage, the chilled cup no longer drew attention, but the understanding behind it remained, showing how small observations can build a clearer picture of the world surrounding a person, even when he cannot move freely within it. In this way, a simple cup of cold water became a small window into a larger system, revealing how climate, technology, and infrastructure intersect in everyday life, and demonstrating that even within confinement, people continue to learn about their environment through ordinary repeated moments, one quiet meal at a time. In the end, the cold water did not change their situation, did not ease the fact of confinement, and did not carry any hidden meaning, yet remained one of those small details where expectation met a different reality, because the men had arrived with habits shaped by climate, tradition, and limited refrigeration, and instead they encountered a system where chilled drinks were normal and easily supported by local infrastructure. And this contrast quietly showed how environment and technology influenced daily life even during a global war. What began as hesitation slowly turned into understanding, as repeated exposure showed that the practice was simply routine rather than unusual. And this shift from caution to acceptance illustrates how people adapt by observing patterns and forming practical explanations, since explanation reduces uncertainty more effectively than assumption. For the prisoners, the lesson was not about temperature, but about perspective, because everyday habits differ across societies, and those habits often reflect resources and systems more than intention. And seeing this firsthand gave them a clearer, more grounded view of the country around them, built from ordinary experiences rather than official statements. Over time, the cold water blended fully into the background of camp life. Yet the memory of their early surprise sometimes remained, because first encounters with difference tend to anchor memory, especially when they involve basic needs like food and drink. Many physical traces of POW life faded after the war, but memories of daily routines lasted longer, and small moments like these helped shape how former prisoners later described captivity, not only through rules and fences, but through quiet details that revealed cultural contrast. And so the story of a chilled cup of water settles as a modest example of how adaptation works, showing that even in confinement, people continue to observe, compare, and learn, and that history is often experienced through small daily encounters as much as through major events, with a simple drink quietly illustrating how different worlds meet across a table during a time of war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.